There comes a point in the life of an empath when compassion is no longer enough. Not because she has stopped caring, but because she finally begins to understand how much of herself she has sacrificed in the name of caring. For years, perhaps most of her life, she has been the one who understands, the one who gives another chance, the one who senses the tension before anyone says a word, the one who notices the change in someone's voice, the distance behind their smile, the sadness hidden beneath their anger. She has learned to enter the emotional worlds of other people so completely that she may have forgotten where their feelings end and hers begin. And because sensitivity has become part of her identity, she may believe that being a good person means remaining open, remaining available, remaining understanding, remaining soft, even when something inside her is screaming no. But eventually, another part of her begins to awaken, a part that is less interested in understanding everyone else, and far more interested in finally understanding herself. This is where the empath encounters what modern language often calls her dark feminine power. Carl Jung did not use the modern term dark feminine energy, and he did not describe a psychological personality type called the empath. But his psychology gives us something far more interesting, because Jung understood what happens when a person becomes trapped inside an identity built around being good. He called that socially acceptable identity the persona, and behind the persona waits everything the personality has been unwilling to become, the shadow. For the empath, that shadow can change everything. Imagine a woman who has spent years unconsciously telling herself, "I am the compassionate one. I am the understanding one. I forgive. I don't make people uncomfortable. I don't abandon people when they're hurting. I can see the pain behind their behavior." These qualities may be genuine, but according to Jung, even beautiful qualities can become dangerous when we mistake them for the whole personality. The persona is the face we learn to present to the world, and the stronger that identity becomes, the more likely its opposite is pushed underground. So ask yourself, if you must always be understanding, what happens to the part of you that wants to say, "Enough"? If you must always forgive, what happens to your anger? If you must always be available, what happens to your desire for privacy? If you must always see the good in people, what happens to your suspicion, your discernment, your ability to recognize danger without explaining it away? Those qualities don't disappear. They enter the shadow, and eventually, the shadow begins demanding to be heard. This is where the empath's transformation can become deeply misunderstood. She may think she's becoming colder, more selfish, more difficult, less spiritual. But psychologically, something very different may be happening. She may simply be reclaiming qualities that her old identity refused to allow. Anger, aggression, desire, skepticism, ambition, self-interest, sexual authority, territoriality, the ability to disappoint someone, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to say no without collapsing into guilt. The Jungian shadow is not simply everything evil inside us. It can also contain strengths we were taught not to possess. A woman taught that assertiveness is selfish may bury her assertiveness. A woman taught that anger is ugly may bury her anger. A woman taught that love means endless forgiveness may bury her ability to hold someone accountable. A woman taught that goodness requires sacrifice may bury the instinct for self-preservation. And then one day, she begins digging those parts of herself back out. This can feel dark, but perhaps what she is discovering isn't darkness at all. Perhaps she is discovering wholeness. One of the first signs of this transformation may be anger. For years, she may have treated anger like evidence that something was wrong with her. So she swallowed it, rationalized it, spiritualized it, explained it away. He had a difficult childhood. She didn't mean it like that. They're struggling. They're just afraid. And perhaps all of those things were true, but understanding why someone hurts you does not require you to continue allowing them to hurt you. This is where anger can acquire a completely different meaning. Healthy anger says, something important has been crossed. It tells you where the boundary should have been. It tells you what you value. It tells you what you have tolerated for too long. Integrated anger does not require cruelty. It does not require revenge. It does not require domination. It requires consciousness. The empath who once used her sensitivity exclusively to understand other people now begins using that sensitivity to understand herself. And that is an enormous shift. Jung's actual writing about empathy is especially fascinating here. He did not simply treat empathy as a mystical ability to absorb other people's feelings. His psychology raises the possibility of projection. And another Jungian concept, participation mystique, describes a state in which the psychological boundary between subject and object becomes blurred. In modern language, you feel something intensely, and you're no longer entirely certain whether it belongs to you or to the person standing in front of you. The mature empath, therefore, learns a new question. Whose feeling is this? Not every feeling she experiences is automatically information about someone else. Sometimes she is accurately perceiving another person. Sometimes an old wound has been activated. Sometimes she is interpreting. Sometimes she is projecting. Sometimes another person's anxiety has triggered anxiety already waiting inside her. Her power increases when she can tell the difference. Because sensitivity without differentiation can become emotional captivity. But sensitivity with discernment becomes wisdom. She can feel your disappointment without making it her emergency. She can understand your pain without making it her responsibility. She can recognize your wounds without volunteering to become the place where you bleed. That is where empathy begins turning into sovereignty. This is the moment often described as a dark, feminine awakening. The woman who once believed goodness required endless accessibility suddenly discovers the sacredness of a closed door. She discovers privacy, standards, silence, erotic autonomy, discernment, the power of withdrawing participation. She stops explaining every boundary. She stops negotiating every no. She stops believing that another person's disappointment automatically means she has done something wrong. And perhaps most unsettling of all, she becomes willing to be misunderstood. This is enormous for the empath. Because the old persona often depended upon being recognized as good, kind, helpful, safe, understanding. But individuation asks a harder question. Who are you when being yourself costs you someone else's approval? This is where the dark feminine becomes psychologically meaningful. Not as cruelty, not manipulation, not superiority, but as contact with the qualities that compulsory goodness forced underground. The empath does not need to become dark. She needs to become whole enough to own the capacities that, being good, forced into darkness. But there is danger here. And Jung would almost certainly warn us about it, because the woman who spent years identified with being infinitely compassionate can simply replace one identity with another. Yesterday, I am the empath. I understand everyone. Tomorrow, I am the dark feminine. I see through everyone. Yesterday, she was endlessly forgiving. Tomorrow, she becomes proudly unreachable. Yesterday, she surrendered all her power. Tomorrow, she believes power means never needing anyone. That isn't necessarily integration. It may simply be another persona, another extreme, another costume. Jung repeatedly warned about inflation. What happens when the ego identifies itself with something psychologically larger and more powerful than itself? So the goal isn't to become an untouchable goddess who believes nobody can manipulate her and everyone else is beneath her. That can be another form of unconsciousness. Real power is quieter. The integrated woman doesn't need to announce that she sees through everyone. She watches, she listens, she tests intuition against reality, and then she chooses. She can be soft without being submissive, powerful without becoming controlling, compassionate without becoming gullible, sexual without requiring validation, angry without becoming cruel, forgiving without reopening the door, understanding without excusing, and loving without abandoning herself. Jung called the larger process individuation. It is the movement toward becoming more fully oneself rather than remaining trapped inside the identities the world gave us. And this is why the empath's encounter with her darkness can be so transformative. She doesn't destroy her sensitivity. She integrates something alongside it: compassion and aggression, receptivity and discrimination, intimacy and separateness, forgiveness and accountability, empathy and boundaries. She no longer has to choose between being the endlessly forgiving woman and the untouchable, dark woman. She becomes capable of both tenderness and refusal. That is a much more formidable kind of power. And perhaps this is the final transformation. The sovereign empath still feels deeply. She still notices. She still understands. She may still walk into a room and sense what other people overlook. But she no longer believes every feeling requires action. She no longer confuses understanding someone with owing them access. She no longer mistakes someone's potential for their character. She no longer sacrifices reality to preserve her image of another person. And she no longer automatically rushes to rescue people from consequences they created themselves. She can witness suffering without surrendering herself to it. She can love someone and recognize that they are unsafe. She can understand someone's childhood and still hold them responsible for their adulthood. She can forgive someone and never speak to them again. She can hear someone else's disappointment and survive it. This may be one of the deepest forms of freedom available to a highly empathic person. To remain capable of connection without disappearing inside the person she is connected to, because her empathy was never supposed to require her erasure. Her compassion was never supposed to become permission for exploitation. And her ability to understand darkness in other people was never supposed to prevent her from confronting darkness when she saw it. Perhaps this is what happens when an empath finally claims her dark feminine power. She doesn't become heartless. She stops handing everyone unrestricted access to her heart. She doesn't stop understanding people. She stops using understanding as an excuse to betray herself. She doesn't become cruel. She becomes capable of saying no. And she doesn't lose her light. She finally becomes strong enough to enter her own darkness, retrieve everything she abandoned there, and return whole. That is not the death of the empath. It is the end of the empath as a prison, and perhaps the beginning of the sovereign woman. If this message found you at the moment you're beginning to reclaim the parts of yourself you once believed were too angry, too powerful, too selfish, too difficult, or simply too much, remember this. Wholeness does not ask you to destroy your softness. It asks you to stop using softness to abandon yourself. And if you're walking that path now, subscribe and continue the journey with us. Because here, on the sovereign path, we don't become whole by running from the shadow. We become whole by learning what it came to teach us.